Okay, boys and girls, I'm going to read to you Captured Off Guard, The Attack on Pearl Harbor by Donald Lemke, illustrated by Claude St. Aubin. The book number, boys and girls, for Reading Renaissance, the number is 11992. Book level is 4.3, and it's worth 1 point, boys and girls. All right, let's get started. Introducing Hank, James, Mr. Jenkins, Mama and Papa. Chapter 1. Hank's Camera. Hank looked up just long enough to see his mother in the doorway. She swayed gently from side to side, trying to comfort his baby brother. James, we'll be here any minute, Hank said, burying his face in the clutter drawer. 2 o'clock, camp out at Howbush. Hank had stared at these words on his calendar for nearly 3 months, 87 days to be exact. He had marked off each day with a giant red X. Now, December 6, 1941, had finally arrived. His best friend would soon arrive for their first overnight camping trip. Every item on Hank's detailed list was packed, except for the most important supply, his camera film. Where is it? I know there's an extra roll in here somewhere. What's all the noise? I'm trying to put your Kakina down for a nap. 2 years ago, for his 13th birthday, Hank received a small Kodak brownie from his grandmother. His eye had been stuck to the camera's viewfinder ever since. Each day after school, he would bike around Iwa Beach and other towns near his home on the island of Oahu. If he spotted a rare bird or even a cool coconut palm, he'd skid to a stop and snap a picture. I'm out of film, Hank mumbled, closing the drawer and giving up his search. Your father has plenty more at the store, his mother said. Just stop on the way to the park. Hank cringed. That's exactly what he was trying to avoid. You know how Papa feels about this thing, Hank said, hanging the camera around his neck. Just wishes you would spend a little more time at the store, she said. Hank, you coming or what? Hey, James, yeah, I'll be right there. Sorry, Mama, I gotta go. Okay, but I hope you'll stop and see your father. Be careful and don't be late for church tomorrow. Aloha, Mrs. Miller. The boys raced along McCool Road. Hank played catch-up as usual, trying to weave in and out of cars as quickly as his friend. He stood up, leaned forward, and pedaled harder. The leather camera strap rubbed against his sweaty neck. He still hadn't decided whether to stop at his father's store. By the time the boys reached town, however, Hank's legs burned like lava. Why are you stopping? You tired already? James yelled back at Hank. I have to pick up some film, he replied. You want pictures of the fish we catch, right? James waited outside while Hank entered the store. At the counter, his father was hunched over a newspaper talking to Mr. Jenkins, a soldier from the nearby naval base called Pearl Harbor. Bang! The door slammed shut behind Hank. Hanky Jr., the soldier exclaimed. Your pa was just telling me about the camping trip. I thought you'd have the tent up by now. I need some film, Hank said softly. Ah, yes, my son, the photographer, Hank's father joked. He shook his head and turned to grab a roll of film off the shelf. He could run the store someday, but he wants to sit around and take pictures of seashells instead. Tension high between US and Japan. Thanks, Papa. Hank grabbed the film and bolted out the front door. He picked up his bike and with a running jump onto the seat, he was headed down the road. A few moments later, James caught up with him. Wow, I've never seen you move so fast, he said, looking surprised. You want to get to the beach before dark, don't you? Hank shot back. He wasn't going to let anything ruin this trip. When they reached Howbush, the boys quickly found a level spot in the sand and set up their tent. Then James grabbed his fishing pole and Hank grabbed his camera. For the rest of the day, the boys enjoyed the cool winds coming off Mamala Bay. They built a fire as the sun set and feasted on the fresh fish and chunks of ripe pineapple. Soon, only a few coals smoldered in the fire pit. James slipped off into the tent and fell asleep. Hank lay down in the sand beneath the perfectly clear sky. He watched the waves crash against the shore. Lit by the full moon, the black and white water reminded him of a photograph. Papa doesn't understand, he thought. Hank didn't want the store. He wanted to take photos of things he'd never seen and places he'd never been before. Chapter 2. The sky turned black. Boom! A loud noise startled Hank. He sprang to his feet and looked around. The sun was up, and the side of his face was covered with sticky sand. I must have fallen asleep, he thought. Hank bent down, picked up his camera, and started brushing it clean. Boom! Another thundering sound rolled in from the east, nearly knocking him over. Hank glanced at his watch. Almost 8 o'clock. When he looked up, James was storming out of the tent. What's going on? James shouted. Sounds like target practice, Hank replied. They were both used to hearing the military at Pearl Harbor fire off practice rounds, but never this early, and never on a Sunday. The booming continued, and the boys decided to pack up the gear and head home. Hank started wrapping up the tent, then suddenly he spotted something over the hill behind them. Smoke! The boys stood in shock. They watched silently as the smoke blackened the clear blue sky. Within moments, they could barely see the sun. The smoke looks like it's coming from Pearl Harbor, yelled Hank. Forget the tent, shouted James. Let's go. They hopped on their bikes and pedaled hard through the sand. Seconds later, they stopped. Not the best time to get tired, Hank. No, look. That plane is going down. The plane banged toward the ground, a ribbon of smoke trailing behind it like a kite's tail. Hank spotted a white star beneath its left wing. It's one of our guys, he yelled. Hank had seen the silvery planes before. Dozens of them lined U.S. military airfields near his house. Kaboom! The plane exploded into the ground. Its flaming shell skidded across a road and plowed into a group of tall kiawe trees. Whoa! Hank and James turned toward each other, stunned. As they as the down plane burned, a loud whistling sound screamed behind them. Look, James, another one! Hank exclaimed, pointing inland. A second silver plane roared toward them, smoke swirling out of its propeller. This one veered left, plunging into the surf and throwing water in the air. What's going on? James asked. Hank recognized the Japanese fighter planes from photos and magazines at his father's store. Now, one was right above him, peppering a U.S. bomber with his machine guns. Thick smoke spewed from bullet holes on the side of the bomber. The American pilot struggled to control his doomed plane. With only a moment to spare, he opened the escape hatch and jumped out. The boys watched the empty bomber slam onto the beach and burst into a giant fireball. A second later, the pilot's parachute opened, and he drifted into a group of trees. Come on, James yelled, spinning his bike around in the sand. He might need help. He might need our help. Hank followed his friend. Looking up at the sky, he saw the Japanese fighter planes turn and head back toward Pearl Harbor. Hank didn't know what was going on, but he knew something was seriously wrong. Before Hank could answer, those aren't all American planes. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. It's the Japanese. Tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. The boys approached the pilot. He was cutting himself free from a tangle of parachute cords. What are you boys doing here? He shouted. We saw your plane crash, sir, James replied. Are you okay? I'm fine, but you boys need to get off of the beach. It's not safe here. We're under attack. The pilot didn't stick around to explain. He gathered up his bag and scrambled toward the smoking ruins of his plane. What did he mean, Hank? James asked. Hank wondered the same thing. At the store, he had overheard Mr. Jenkins and his father talk about the war many times. As Hank stocked shelves, the men discussed how Germany and Japan were invading countries in Europe and Asia. While he swept the floors, they debated about how the United States had stopped trading with Japan. He had never heard them talk about an attack, though. No one would be crazy enough to attack the United States. I don't know, Hank finally replied, but we need to get back to town fast. The boys sped off. A mile up the road, they stopped. In front of them stood a group of U.S. soldiers blocking the road and the way home. Now what? James asked, something sounding panicked. Hank looked around. The sky had turned into a giant thundercloud of smoke. Hundreds of planes buzzed on the horizon. Violent explosions shook the ground beneath his feet. "We can't stay here," Hank said. Let's head to the lower village until things calm down." The boys raced north along Fort Weaver Road. By the time they reached the lower village, the angry swarm of planes were right above them. Rat-tat-tat-tat! The Japanese fighters sprayed the ground with bullets. People screamed, dodging the machine gun fire and heading for cover. "Hurry!" James cried out. "We need to get—" Boom! The road exploded in a shower of rocks and dirt, throwing James from his bike. Hank jumped off his bike and ran to his friend. James was alive, but his leg was bleeding and he couldn't walk. "Grab on! Over there!" The boys stepped into a gas station. Dozens of local residents were huddled there inside. In the corner, a woman covered her baby's ears against the explosions. At the back door, a man tore a piece of cloth to bandage his wounded hand. Others crowded around a radio at the front counter. "Are you boys okay?" The man at the counter asked him. "His leg is bleeding, but I think we're all right," Hank replied, trying to catch his breath. "What's happening out there?" "That's what we're trying to find out," the man said, putting his ear to the radio and jiggling the knobs. Hank and James moved in closer, waiting to hear something, anything about the situation. After a few moments, a loud man's voice barked through the static. "Get off roads and stay off. Don't block traffic. Stay at home. This is the real McCoy." The radio announcer repeated the words over and over. Hank and James looked at each other, wondering what to do. Then the man standing near the back door spoke up. "I'm heading to the sugar cane fields," he said. "Who's coming with me?" The group stood silently, waiting for someone to answer. Hank looked toward the front window. Sirens started to blare and dozens of military trucks rolled through the town. The man on the radio said to stay put. The woman with the baby said, "Every building in this town is a target," the man said, raising his voice. "The sugarcane fields are the safest place until the attack is over." Some of the other residents agreed and started heading for the door. James pulled Hank aside. "What are we going to do, Hank?" he asked. "I think we should hide in the fields." For the first time since that morning, Hank felt the weight of the camera around his neck. He looked back up at the window. Through the glass, the action seemed to stop, like the moment before a photograph. Hank knew what he had to do. "I'm heading to Pearl Harbor." "Are you crazy?" James yelled, grabbing Hank. "It's not safe. Besides, I can't make it that far." Hank looked down at James' right leg. His jeans were stained red with blood from the knee down. "I know," Hank said. "I'm going alone." He didn't have time to explain. Hank hugged his friend, clutched his camera tight, and then headed out the door. This was a chance to make his father proud. Chapter 3: Under Attack. Outside, swarms of Japanese fighter planes were buzzing overhead. Hank sprinted down the road, which was pitted with crates and littered with old cars. He searched for his bike. Nothing. Maybe this was a bad idea, Hank thought. He looked back at the gas station. James and the others were leaving, headed in the direction of the sugarcane fields. If he ran fast enough, he could still follow them to safety. Military trucks and ambulances rushed past in the other direction toward Pearl Harbor. "No," Hank yelled out loud. "I'm not going to sit around and hide." He started walking, following the dusty trail of military vehicles. The sky had turned nearly as black as night, and flames burst all around him. The road wasn't safe, so he scrambled into the woods. Branches and leaves slashed at his face and hands. He kept running. He reached higher ground and a better view of the harbor. Oh no! Rat-tat-tat-tat, crack, boom, kaboom, tat-tat-tat. On the hill, Hank looked down at Pearl Harbor. For a moment, he couldn't move. He stood completely frozen with shock. Hank had often biked past the harbor. Each time he would stop and snap pictures of the 8 giant ships docked along Battleship Row. Their large silver hulls cast perfect reflections onto the turquoise water. Hank had memorized each one of their names, labeling every photo he developed. Now, half of the battleships were on fire. throwing thick smoke from the top of their masts. The water had turned into an inky pool of oil. Thousands of US soldiers darted in every direction. The whole scene was too much for Hank. Without thinking, he picked up his camera and put his eye on the viewfinder. Through the camera's lens, Hank scanned the harbor, trying to focus on a single image. Click, click, click. Then, Hank saw what looked like a group of planes approaching on the horizon. He snapped a picture. For a brief moment, the camera's shutter closed, and the viewfinder went black. When it opened, Hank could clearly see the markings on the planes. A second attack wave. Japanese fighters and bombers dove into the harbor like a group of hungry birds. Immediately, sailors on the USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, and other battleships began firing their anti-aircraft guns. Black puffs of smoke burst in the sky, hitting several Japanese planes, which spiraled into the harbor. The battleships continued taking heavy fire. The USS Pennsylvania, docked at the Navy Yard, exploded in a flurry of bomber attacks. Smaller destroyers and cruiser ships started to sink beneath the oily water. Still, nothing could have prepared Hank for what he saw next. Zzz, kaboom, click. Hank felt the heat of the explosion against his face. He tried to snap another picture, but the film was gone. He took off the camera from around his neck and placed it on the ground. Then he searched frantically through his pockets for another roll of film. Suddenly, a voice shouted up from the road below. "Hank, is that you?" "Who knows I'm up here?" Hank wondered. He started down toward the road, peering through the trees and trying to get a better look. "Mr. Jenkins!" Hank yelled. He saw his father's friend waving from inside an old military truck. Hank scurried down the hill. "What are you doing?" asked Mr. Jenkins. "It's not safe out here." Hank looked down at the ground, trying to think of an excuse. I was just. "It doesn't matter," Mr. Jenkins interrupted. "I just learned the Ewa airfield has been attacked." "Mama!" Hank exclaimed. The airfield was close to his house. "Mr. Jenkins, is my family all right? Get on, I'm headed that way. Hurry!" Chapter 4. Finding his family. The old truck rattled toward Ewa Beach. In the distance, Hank spotted dark smoke rising from the airfield. He felt ashamed. How could he have left his family alone for so long? His mother would be worried sick if she was still okay. When they finally reached the town, Mr. Jenkins slowed the truck to a crawl. Hank looked around, scanning the area for a familiar face. Most of the residents had retreated to their homes, and the road was nearly empty. Several cars had their tires blown out and were splattered with bullet holes. Mr. Jenkins turned the corner onto Hank Street. "Stop, Mr. Jenkins!" Hank yelled. "Stop! My house!" "Get back here, Hank. It's too dangerous. I have to see if my family's okay." Hank ran into the house. Inside, the walls of the living room dripped with flames. He yelled for his mother. No answer. Hank hurried down the hallway, stepping over shattered floorboards and dodging falling embers. When he finally reached his room, Hank pounded open the door with his shoulders. Ah, oh no. Peaceful pictures that once plastered Hank's walls now covered his floor. Hank bent down. He spotted his favorite one of them all. It was taken 2 months ago, a week after his baby brother was born. James had been there too, but he offered to take the photograph. This was the only picture Hank had of his whole family together. Now he worried that his chances of seeing them all again were slipping away. "Mama!" Hank shouted, slumping to the floor. "Hank?" A muffled voice cried from the hallway. Hank rushed out of the bedroom. The hallway was turning into a smoke-filled chimney. He fell to his knees and started crawling along the floor. "Mama, where are you?" he yelled. "I'm here, in here, Hank. We're trapped." Hank heard pounding from inside the hall closet. When he got closer, Hank saw his mother's delicate fingers reaching out through a crack in the doorway. The door was blocked. As the hallway filled with smoke, Hank scrambled to remove the boards. Finally, "Mama, I'm so glad you're okay, Hank. I thought we'd be safe in here. We need to get out. Hank and his mother slid off the front porch, coughing and wheezing. Once he caught his breath, Hank hugged his mother and kissed his baby brother on the forehead. It had been less than a day since he last saw them, but it felt like everything had changed. "Where's Papa?" Hank asked. "Never came home from the store," his mother replied, sounding worried. Hank looked back at the road. Mr. Jenkins was still there, waving the family into his truck. They hopped in and took off toward the store. On the way, Hank heard more planes roar in the sky. "It's our guys! They're fighting back!" Hank didn't see any more Japanese planes as the truck sped down the road. By the time they reached the store, he wondered if the fighting had finally ended. Hank helped his mother into the store. Inside, dozens of local residents greeted them. Their neighbor, Miss Wong, Hank's teacher, Mr. Miller, even his little league coach were all there. They had come for shelter and to wait out the attack. Hank spotted his father. He was near the counter, handing out food and supplies. "It's Papa! Hank!" "Oh, thank goodness." "I tried to make it home, but the roads were blocked," his father said, nearly crying. "Then people started showing up for help." "It's okay, Papa," Hank said. "We're all okay." He hugged his father and thought about the morning, and couldn't wait to show him the photographs he had taken. He could prove that he hadn't been afraid. He hadn't just sat around. Hank pulled away from his father and looked down for his camera. "I lost it." Hank's camera was gone. He grabbed at his neck. It couldn't have fallen, he thought. I would have heard it drop. "What's wrong, Hank?" his father asked. "I lost my camera," Hank gasped, frantically looking around the room. "It's okay, son," his father said. "I can order you a new one." "You don't understand," Hank sobbed. "All of my pictures, everything that happened this morning. I wanted to show you." "You helped your mother and brother get here safely. That's the most important thing." His father headed back to the front counter. Hank watched as he continued handing out supplies to anyone in need. Until that moment, Hank hadn't realized how important the store and his father were to the count. Bang! A loud noise startled Hank, and he spun around expecting the worst this time. James! James' leg was bandaged at the knee, and he was limping. Hank walked toward him. "It took you so long," Hank joked, not knowing what to say. James looked down at his injured leg. "Very funny," he said. James knew his friend was glad to see him. During the next few days, Hank thought about searching for his camera, but he helped his father at the store instead. He stocked shelves, wiped down the counters, and swept broken glass off the front porch. While there, Hank and his father listened to the president on the radio talk about the attack. In the newspapers, they read about the thousands of soldiers that died at Pearl Harbor. They read about they read that the United States had declared war on Japan. "I'm too old," Hank's father said, reading the paper, "but I wish I could help out the country." "You already do, Papa," Hank said, looking at the long line of customers. In the coming months, U.S. soldiers fought battles half a world away, and Hank continued working for his father. Then one day, a package arrived at the store. "Wow, just like the ones real photographers use." "Thanks, Papa," Hank exclaimed. Hank's father continued sweeping the floor. "I know you'll put it to good use," he said, not looking up. Hank thought about his missing camera. It had been filled with dozens of photographs he would never see again. But now Hank knew he'd have the chance to take many more. November 10, 1943, United States Navy. Dear Mama and Papa, I just arrived in Manila. Manila. Thought you'd want to. I thought you'd want to me in my new. Oh, I thought you want to see me in my new uniform. Oh. Thank you, boys and girls.